9 years. That is 3,285 days of being a ghost in my own skin. They say blood is thicker than water, but in the Sterling family, blood is just a currency, and for a decade, my account has been bone dry. My name is Elena Sterling. I am 31 years old. And for the last 9 years, my family has introduced me to the world as a clerical assistant. A glorified paper pusher. A girl who files the dreams of more important people into manila folders. Tonight, I am standing 42 stories above the pavement, the city of Oakhaven spreading out beneath me like a carpet of crushed diamonds. The air up here is thin, cold, and tastes like ozone. To my left, the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Iron Rose Tower reflects a woman my mother wouldn't recognize. I'm wearing a silk dress that cost more than my father's first car, and in my hand is a master keycard that grants me total control over every elevator, every light, and every security sensor in this $50 million landmark. But as I watch a black sedan pull up to the curb far below, my chest tightens. They're here. My father, with his spine like a steel rod, my mother, with her eyes that only see in shades of status, and my brother, Julian. The golden child, the visionary architect who thinks he's about to inherit the sky. They have no idea that the woman they call the assistant is the one who holds the deed to the ground they're standing on. My mother, Catherine, always had a way of apologizing for me before I even opened my mouth. She'd lean in close to her friends at the country club, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper that carries further than a shout, and say, "Elena is finding herself. She's helping out at a local firm. It's stable work. Stable. Like a horse in a stall. Like a stone at the bottom of a lake." She'd say it with a tight, pained smile, the kind you wear when you're explaining away a stain on the heirloom rug. My father, Arthur, was worse. He didn't whisper. He just looked through me as if I were a window that needed cleaning. Every holiday, every birthday, every awkward Sunday brunch, he'd wait for the silence to stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable, then he'd turn to Julian and ask about his latest skyscraper. And then, he'd look at me, shake his head, and mutter the same 6 words that have been the soundtrack to my life since I was 22, "At least your brother has a real career." I've heard it at Thanksgiving while I was passing the gravy. I've heard it at Christmas while Julian opened a watch that cost 5 figures. I've heard it in the hallways of their house in North Hill, echoed by the neighbors who were taught to pity the other Sterling daughter. But the secret I've been keeping is a silent storm. The world thinks this tower belongs to a faceless entity called Vanguard Heritage. They think a committee of suits in some boardroom made this happen. They don't know about the 5 a.m. site visits. They don't know about the concrete dust under my fingernails or the way I've bled for every square foot of this restoration. Most importantly, they don't know what I saw on that phone screen 3 weeks ago. The message that changed the game. The message that proved that in this family, you aren't just a disappointment, you're a target. Before I show you the moment the glass finally shattered, I need you to understand how deep the foundation of this lie goes. I need you to see the night I stopped being a daughter and started being a ghost. It was 9 years ago, the night I told my father I was walking away from the medical path he had paved for me. He sat in his leather wingback chair, the smoke from his cigar curling like a snake, and told me that if I left, I'd be nothing. He told me I'd spend my life serving people like him. I told him he was right. I just didn't tell him I'd be the one sending him the bill. The Sunday dinners at the Sterling estate were never about food. They were about the hierarchy. We sat at a mahogany table that felt like it was 3 miles long, the silver polished to a mirror finish so you could see your own disappointment reflected in your spoon. I sat at the far end, the low-rent end, while Julian sat to my father's right. Julian was the Prince of Oakhaven. He had the jawline of a Greek statue and the ego to match. He was a partner at Miller and Associates, the most prestigious architectural firm in the tri-state area. Or at least, that's what my father told everyone. Julian's firm is in the running for the Iron Rose restoration, Arthur said, his voice booming with a pride he never spared for me. The city hasn't seen a project this significant in 50 years. It's a career maker. A legacy builder. Julian leaned back, swirling a glass of expensive Bordeaux. It's a tough bid, Dad. Vanguard Heritage is the holding company, and they're incredibly secretive. No one even knows who the principal is. But we've got the best design in the city. It's only a matter of time before they sign the contract. I felt a ghost of a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. I kept my head down, focusing on my roasted carrots. I was the one who had written the rejection letter to Julian's firm 3 days ago. I was the one who had marked his visionary design as derivative and structurally unimaginative in red ink. But here, in this room, I was just the girl who forgot to bring the extra napkins. Elena, honey, my mother said, her voice dripping with that patronizing sweetness that makes your teeth ache. How is the filing going at your office? Do they have you doing anything exciting? Perhaps a new color coding system? The table chuckled. Not a loud, cruel laugh. A soft, polite murmur. The kind of laughter that tells you you're a joke they've all agreed on. It's fine, Mom, I said, keeping my voice level. I'm learning a lot about how things are built from the ground up. Built? My father snorted. You aren't building anything, Elena. You're assisting. There's a difference. You're the support staff for people who actually have the vision. You're the person who makes sure the real architects have their coffee. At least your brother has a real career. He's shaping the skyline while you're shuffling papers. The weight of his words usually felt like lead. Tonight, they felt like fuel. I looked at Julian, who was basking in the glow of my father's approval. He knew. He knew I was more capable than a clerical assistant. He'd seen my sketches when we were kids. He'd seen the way I could look at a derelict building and see the soul inside it. But he never defended me. Why would he? My failure was the pedestal he stood on. As long as I was the shuffling paper daughter, he was the skyline-shaping son. He needed me to be small so he could feel giant. After dinner, I helped the maid, Maria, clear the plates. It was a habit I couldn't break, a lingering need to be useful, to be invisible. As I walked past the study, I saw Julian and my father through the half-open door. They were looking at a map of the city. When I get that tower, Arthur, Julian said, his voice dropping into a tone I'd never heard before. Cold, calculating. I'm going to put the Sterling name on the spire. We won't just be the family that lives in North Hill. We'll be the family that owns Oakhaven. And Elena? My father asked. She can keep her job, Julian said, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. We'll need someone to answer the phones at the new headquarters. It'll give her a sense of purpose. I walked away quietly, my heels making no sound on the plush carpet. I went back to my one-bedroom apartment above a noisy bakery in the old district. I sat at my drafting table, surrounded by blueprints of the Iron Rose, and I ran the numbers. Vanguard Heritage was clearing $4 million a month in revenue from its other properties. The Iron Rose was the crown jewel. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their pride. I had the keys. But then, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from an app I'd forgotten I had, a shared family photo stream. And what I saw there wasn't a blueprint. It was a betrayal. I didn't think I could be surprised by them anymore. After 9 years of eye rolls and apologies, I thought my skin was thick enough to deflect anything they threw. I was wrong. It was a Wednesday evening, raining, the kind of drizzle that turns the city gray and makes the streetlights look like blurred teardrops. I was in my office, the real one, the one on the 38th floor of a building they didn't know I owned. I was reviewing the final marble selections for the lobby when my phone chimed. A notification from the Sterling family vault. It was a private group chat and photo sharing thread my mother had started years ago. I had never been invited to the chat, I only knew it existed because I'd seen it on Julian's phone once, but apparently, someone had messed up the permissions. Margaret, my cousin and a woman who couldn't navigate a smartphone to save her life, had accidentally added me to the thread while trying to forward a photo. I scrolled up. It was like reading a transcript of my own funeral while I was still standing in the room. The thread was titled The Sterling Successors. There were 5 members: Mom, Dad, Julian, Aunt Lorraine, and Margaret. I spent the next hour reading 3 years of history. Did you see Elena's outfit at brunch? My mother had written last Easter. Poor thing. She looks like she's dressing for a funeral. I suppose when your life is that dull, you dress the part. Julian, on the other hand, looked like a CEO. She's just not built for the fast lane, Catherine, Aunt Lorraine had replied. Some people are born to lead, others are born to file the paperwork. We should be glad she's at least holding down a job. It would be so much worse if we had to support her financially on top of the social embarrassment. Then I saw the message from 3 days ago. The one that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. It was from Julian. He had sent a screenshot of the Vanguard Heritage rejection letter, the one I had signed as the principal. This faceless coward at Vanguard rejected the design, Julian wrote. I'm going to find out who Sterling is. I'm going to make them an offer they can't refuse, or I'm going to find the leverage to break them. Dad, keep the pressure on Elena. If she hears anything at her firm about Vanguard's movements, tell her to leak it to us. She's too dim to realize it's industrial espionage. She'll do it just to feel like part of the team. My father's reply came minutes later. Consider it done. I'll remind her how much we've sacrificed for her assistant lifestyle. She'll fold. She always does. At least her brother has a real career to protect. I sat in the silence of my office, the blue light of the phone screen reflecting in the window. They didn't just think I was a failure. They thought I was a tool. A dim asset to be used and discarded. They were planning to use my pathetic job to spy on the very company I had built from nothing. I looked at the framed deed on my wall. I looked at the name Vanguard Heritage LLC. And then I looked at the folder on my phone I'd labeled evidence. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. I had been playing the part of the ghost for 9 years, waiting for them to finally see me. But they were never going to see me. They were only ever going to see what they could take from me. I saved the screenshots. I backed them up to 3 different servers. I didn't confront Julian. I didn't text my mother. I simply walked over to my desk, picked up the phone, and called my head of security, a man named Miller who didn't ask questions as long as the checks cleared. Miller, I said, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. The gala for the Iron Rose opening in 3 weeks. I want the guest list modified. I want 3 specific invitations sent out tonight. Personal delivery. And I want the security protocols changed. No one gets past the lobby without a biometric scan. Not even the VIPs from the Miller firm. Understood, boss, Miller replied. Anything else? Yes, I said, looking out at the city that was finally, truly mine. I need a photographer. A good one. I have a feeling there's going to be a moment at the penthouse elevators that the Sterling family will want to remember forever. I hung up. I felt a strange, quiet thrill in my chest. The bomb was set. The timer was ticking. And as I looked at the folded photo on my desk, the one I'd taken from my mother's house, where she'd literally creased the paper to hide my face from my own graduation, I realized that the hardest part wasn't going to be the reveal. The hardest part was going to be watching them try to figure out how a waitress bought the sky. But as I prepared to leave, my computer pinged with a high-priority alert. Someone was trying to bypass the Iron Rose's server firewall. Someone from an IP address registered to Miller and Associates. Julian wasn't waiting for the gala. He was digging now. And he was seconds away from finding a name he wasn't prepared to see. The notification on my monitor pulsed like a digital heartbeat. Read. Urgent. My brother wasn't just knocking on the door of my secrets, he was trying to kick it down. I watched the cursor dance across the screen as my security software tracked the intrusion. The IP address was a direct line to Julian's private office at Miller and Associates. He was desperate. The rejection letter I'd sent him hadn't just bruised his ego, it had threatened his lifeline. For Julian, the Iron Rose wasn't just a building. It was the only thing keeping his golden boy status from tarnishing. But as I sat there, watching his clumsy attempt to hack into the Vanguard Heritage servers, I realized this started long before Julian learned how to use a keyboard. To understand the fury behind my silence, you have to see the day the foundation truly cracked. 9 years ago. The day I stopped being a person and became a disappointment. I was 22, a month away from graduating with honors from a pre-med program that felt like a straitjacket. My father had already picked out my medical school. He had already planned my residency. He spoke about my future as if it were a merger he had already brokered. But I had spent my nights in the university library not studying anatomy, but urban planning and historical restoration. I was obsessed with the soul of the city. The forgotten stone, the rusted iron, the stories buried under decades of neglect. The confrontation happened in the study of our North Hill estate. The room smelled of expensive scotch and old money. My father sat behind his desk, looking at me like a balance sheet that didn't add up. When I told him I wasn't going to medical school, that I had been accepted into a graduate program for architectural restoration, the silence was so heavy I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. Restoration? He finally said, the word sounding like a slur. You want to spend your life cleaning up other people's messes? You want to be a glorified janitor for old buildings? It's about preservation, Dad, I said, my voice shaking. It's about building something that lasts. You don't build anything with a scrub brush, Elena, he snapped, standing up. Julian builds. Julian creates. You're a dreamer. And dreamers end up broke. If you walk away from this path, you walk away from my support. I won't fund a hobby that treats ruins like cathedrals. I don't want your money, I told him. He laughed then. It was a cold, jagged sound. Good. Because you won't have it. You'll be back in 6 months, begging for a secretarial job at the firm. And I'll give it to you, just so I can remind you every day of what you threw away. Until then, don't expect me to lie to our friends. I'll tell them you're finding yourself. It's the polite way of saying you've failed before you've even started. I left that night with one suitcase and a heart made of flint. He thought he was punishing me by withdrawing his wealth, but he was actually giving me the only gift I ever really needed, the freedom of being forgotten. When you are the disappointment, people stop watching you. And when people stop watching you, you can move mountains in the dark. For 9 years, I lived in that darkness. I took the assistant jobs he laughed at, but I used them to learn the industry from the inside out. I learned how contractors hid costs. I learned how zoning boards were swayed. I learned how to read a deed like a map to a treasure chest. And while Julian was being paraded at galas as the next big thing, I was quietly buying up the messy properties my father despised. I wasn't a janitor. I was a ghost. And ghosts don't need permission to haunt the halls of power. The Iron Rose Tower wasn't just another project. It was the Iron Rose for a reason. It was built in 1912, a Gothic masterpiece of steel and stone that had been left to rot by owners who saw only the cost of repair. My father had tried to buy it 10 years ago to tear it down and build a glass and chrome monstrosity. He failed because the owner, a man named Silas Thorne, hated everything my father stood for. Silas was a recluse, a billionaire who lived in a crumbling mansion and spoke to no one. My father sent lawyers. I sent a letter. I didn't send it as Elena Sterling, I sent it as a girl who loved the way the sun hit the copper cornices of the tower at 4 p.m. I wrote to him about the history of the foundry that forged the iron. I wrote about the ghost of the architect who died before the spire was finished. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in Silas's dusty library. He was 84, with eyes like ancient embers. He looked at me, then at the portfolio of sketches I had brought, restoration plans that respected every rivet and stone. Your father wants to kill this building, Silas said, his voice a low rasp. He wants to put his name on a tombstone. You? You want to give it a heartbeat. I can't afford the market value, Mr. Thorne, I admitted. Not yet. Market value is for people who don't have a soul, he replied. He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a private, 10-year seller-financed contract. The interest rate was negligible. The down payment was everything I had saved from 3 assistant jobs over 5 years. You take this building. You build your company, this Vanguard heritage. But you keep your name off the masthead until the last brick is laid. Your father and his ilk, they prey on what they can see. Be the hunter they never hear coming. I signed the contract with a shaking hand. For the next 4 years, the Iron Rose became my secret love affair. I spent my nights on the scaffolding, wearing a hard hat and a high-vis vest, working alongside the masonry experts I'd hired with Silas's guidance. I learned the language of mortar and the temperament of old steel. I became a CEO who knew exactly how much pressure a load-bearing wall could take because I'd touched the cracks myself. During the day, I went to the Sterling family dinners. I sat at the end of the table and listened to Julian brag about his minimalist glass boxes that would leak in 5 years. I listened to my father tell the Hendersons that I was helping with filing at a mid-sized firm in the city. I felt the sting of their pity, but I used it as a shield. Let them think I was a failure. Let them think I was small. The smaller they thought I was, the more room I had to grow. Vanguard Heritage became a powerhouse in the shadows. We didn't just restore the Iron Rose, we bought the surrounding warehouses and turned them into high-end lofts. We revitalized the district. And every time my father complained about the mysterious group that was outbidding him for the best lots in Oakhaven, I just passed him the salt and smiled. But Silas's warning remained, they prey on what they can see. Julian was now looking. He was digging into the digital archives, trying to unmask the principal who had dared to reject his firm's bid. He didn't know he was hunting his own sister. He didn't know that the dim girl he wanted to use as a spy was the one holding the magnifying glass over his head. I watched the progress bar on my screen. Julian was getting closer. He had just breached the first layer of the LLC's encryption, the one I had left intentionally weak to lead him into a trap. I checked the time. It was nearly midnight. In a few minutes, the search query would hit the secondary vault. It wouldn't show my name yet, I wasn't that careless, but it would show a single, high-resolution image of the Iron Rose spire, taken from a drone, with a watermark that Julian would recognize instantly. A watermark from a private drafting software I had used as a teenager. I picked up my desk phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. My mother's private line. It was late, but she never slept well when there was a social season approaching. Elena? She answered, her voice sharp with surprise. It's after midnight. Is something wrong? Did you lose your job? Everything is fine, Mom, I said, watching the monitor. Julian's hack was seconds away from the payload. I just wanted to make sure you received the invitation for the gala at the Iron Rose. It was personally delivered today. Oh, that, she said, her tone shifting back to that familiar dismissive trill. Yes, we got it. Julian is quite annoyed, you know. He thinks it's a bit pretentious of Vanguard to invite the people they rejected. But we'll be there. Your father wants to see if he can corner the owner. And Elena, we've decided you should come as Julian's guest. It would look better than you showing up alone with that clerical look of yours. I'll be there, Mom, I said, as the monitor flashed green. Julian had just downloaded the file. But I won't be coming as anyone's guest. Don't be difficult, dear. Just wear something that doesn't scream entry-level. We have a reputation to maintain, even if you don't. I hung up as a muffled shout echoed through my phone's speakers, not from my mother, but from the background of her house. It was Julian. He had opened the file. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of the penthouse wrapping around me. The golden boy had just found the first breadcrumb, and it was leading him straight into a mirror. But there was one thing I hadn't accounted for. As I glanced at the security feed for the lobby downstairs, a car I didn't recognize pulled up. A man stepped out, not a Sterling, and not one of my employees. It was a lawyer I hadn't seen in years, a man who had worked for Silas Thorne before he died. And he wasn't carrying an invitation. He was carrying a folder embossed with a seal I hadn't seen in a decade. The game was changing, and the big reveal was no longer just in my hands. I stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. If Silas had left a final card to play, it meant the $4.7 million assessed value of the building was only the beginning of the story. I walked toward the elevator, the master keycard glowing in my hand. Downstairs, the man from the past was waiting, and upstairs, my brother was realizing that the ghost he'd been mocking for 9 years was about to become his worst nightmare. But as the elevator doors hissed open, the power in the building flickered. Once. Twice. And then the entire Iron Rose Tower went pitch black. Someone hadn't just hacked the servers, they had cut the cord. And I was no longer alone in the dark. The darkness wasn't empty. It was heavy, smelling of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of the building's silent heartbeat. Standing in the stalled elevator, 40 stories above the ground, I realized that Julian's desperation had finally manifested into something physical. He wasn't just looking for leverage anymore, he was trying to seize the mountain. But Julian always underestimated the foundation. He thought cutting the power would blind the ghost, but I had spent years learning the layout of this tower in the dark, feeling the grain of the stone and the pulse of the pipes when the city was asleep. I reached for the emergency panel, my fingers moving with a precision that comes only from ownership. I didn't just know where the buttons were, I knew the wiring behind them. I hadn't spent 9 years shuffling papers, I had spent them becoming the nervous system of this landmark. While Julian was back at his office, likely staring at a crashed server and a drone-shot watermark that whispered of his own sister's childhood, I was navigating the guts of the Iron Rose. I pulled the manual release, the heavy steel doors groaning as they slid back. I stepped out into the 39th floor corridor, the emergency lights flickering on like weak, dying stars. This was the moment the Golden Boy moved from digital espionage to a full-scale assault. He had bragged to our father that he was the one who had secured the tower, that the Sterling name would be on the spire. He had lied to the man who gave him everything, and now he was trying to make that lie a reality by brute force. He didn't just want the contract, he wanted to find the principal and force a hand before the gala. He wanted to walk into that boardroom as a conqueror before the public found out he was a fraud. I moved through the darkness toward the emergency stairwell, my mind racing. The car I had seen on the security feed, the lawyer, Mr. Vance, was the missing piece. He had been Silas Thorne's shadow, the keeper of the unspoken clauses. If he was here now, in the middle of a blackout, it meant the 10-year contract Silas and I had signed wasn't just a purchase agreement. It was a test. Silas had hated the way my father operated, but he also knew that power inherited is power wasted. He had seen the golden child Julian and the disappointment Elena, and he had placed a bet on the dark horse. I reached the landing and began the long descent, the rhythm of my footsteps echoing through the concrete shell. Every flight of stairs felt like a year of the lie falling away. Down at the gala site, the ballroom was a skeleton of luxury, shrouded in plastic and shadows. Julian's firm was supposed to be the one bringing the light, but instead, he was the one who had brought the dark. I could see him now, in my mind's eye, standing at his desk, his jaw tight, his hands shaking as he realized the watermark on the server wasn't a glitch. It was a signature. He had mocked my clerical look, he had called me dim, and he had planned to use me as a pawn in a game I had invented. The irony was a bitter, cold weight. He was trying to break into the penthouse to find the deed, to find the names, to find anything he could use to blackmail the owner into a partnership. He thought he was hunting a corporate rival. He didn't realize he was hunting the girl who used to pass him the gravy while he told her she was nothing. The blackout wasn't just a technical failure, it was the great lie beginning to collapse. Julian had promised our father a legacy, and now, 48 hours before the grand opening, he was sabotaging the very building he claimed to represent. I reached the lobby level, my lungs burning, the air thick with the scent of wet cement and ozone. The glass doors were locked, but I saw the silhouette of Mr. Vance standing outside in the rain, the amber glow of a street lamp catching the silver of his hair. He looked like a sentinel from another era. I used the mechanical override at the security desk, the heavy brass locks clicking open. As Vance stepped inside, he didn't look surprised to see me emerging from the shadows of a dead building. "He's moved faster than Silas anticipated," Vance said, his voice a dry parchment rustle. He didn't ask why the lights were out. He knew. The hack was just the distraction. "Julian is at the county clerk's office now, Elena. He's not looking for digital files anymore. He's looking for the original wet ink signatures from the Thorne estate. He thinks if he can prove the seller financing was predatory, he can tie the deed up in litigation for a decade." "He won't find a name he recognizes," I said, wiping the dust from my palms. "The LLC is nested. The signatures are under the hospitality group. He doesn't need to recognize the name to ruin the reputation," Vance replied, handing me a heavy, leather-bound folder. Silas knew this day would come. He knew the Sterlings couldn't help themselves when they saw something beautiful they didn't own. "There is a secondary deed in here, Elena. One that doesn't just cover the building. It covers the ground beneath your father's own house. Silas didn't just sell you a tower. He sold you the Sterling legacy, piece by piece, over 9 years. You don't just own this building. You own them." The weight of the folder felt like a mountain. I looked up at the darkened spire of the Iron Rose, towering into the rainy night. Julian was out there, digging through paper trails, trying to bury me. My father was at home, toasting to a real career that was built on a foundation of theft. And my mother was likely picking out a dress to wear to a gala where she expected to be a queen. They thought they were the architects of Oakhaven. They didn't realize they were just tenants in a world I had quietly bought from under their feet. The hunt had begun. But as I turned to head back to the stairs, a single light flickered on at the very top of the tower. A light in my private penthouse. A light I hadn't turned on. Someone was already inside. The climb back up felt different. The adrenaline had been replaced by a cold, predatory focus. Every floor I passed was a reminder of the moment of total erasure. I remembered a dinner from 3 years ago, the night Julian was named Architect of the Year by a local magazine. The family had gathered at North Hill, the champagne flowing like water, the room filled with the scent of lilies and triumph. I had arrived late, still wearing my work clothes from a site visit, my hair damp from the rain. My mother had looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, then turned to the photographer. "Let's get a shot of the family," she'd said. "Just the 3 of us. Elena, dear, could you hold the flash? You're so good at being helpful." I had stood there, a shadow in the corner of my own family's history, holding the light for the people who refused to see me. I had watched the flash bulb pop, capturing my parents flanking Julian like proud bookends, while I was cropped out of the frame before the photo was even developed. That was the day I realized that their love wasn't unconditional, it was a transaction. They didn't want a daughter, they wanted a reflection. And since I didn't reflect their narrow definition of success, I didn't exist. I was the ghost who held the light. Well, tonight, the light was on in the penthouse, and I wasn't the one holding it. I reached the top floor, my breath ragged, the folder from Vance tucked tightly under my arm. The penthouse doors were mahogany and steel, reinforced and silent. They were slightly ajar. I pushed them open, stepping into the space that was meant to be my sanctuary. The room was flooded with the pale, clinical light of a high-powered work lamp. And there, standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, was my father. He wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at the framed deed on the wall. The one that listed Walsh Hospitality Group. He was holding a glass of my most expensive scotch, his face a mask of confusion and mounting rage. He turned when he heard me, the ice in his glass clinking against the crystal. "Elena," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, though it had an edge like a serrated knife. "I suppose I should have known. Julian is back at the office crying about hacks and watermarks, but I've always known you were the more observant one. I assumed you were here to steal the guest list for your little firm. To get a head start on the clerical work for the real owners. What are you doing here, Dad? I asked, staying in the shadows near the doorway. I came to meet the man who beat me, Arthur said, gesturing to the room. The man who bought the iron rose from Silas Thorne while I was busy playing by the rules. I expected a titan. I expected someone I could negotiate with. Instead, I find my daughter, lurking in the dark like a common thief. Did you sleep with the night watchman to get the key? Or did you just wait for the power to go out to play act as someone important? He walked toward the deed, his finger tracing the glass over the $4.7 million assessment. Walsh Hospitality. A common name. A generic name. Just like you, Elena. Unremarkable. But whoever this Walsh is, he's smart. He's stayed in the shadows. He's waited. And now Julian tells me that this Walsh has been outbidding us for years. I came here to offer him a partnership. To bring the Sterling name back to this building. The Sterling name is already on the spire, Dad, I said, stepping into the light. You just don't know how it got there. He laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Don't be delusional. You're a drafting assistant. You're the girl who passes the gravy. You're the disappointment I have to explain away at the club. You think because you're standing in this room, you own it? Possession isn't 9/10 of the law, Elena. Ownership is. And you own nothing. You're a squatter in a dress you can't afford. He set the Scotch glass down on a marble table with a sharp thwack. When Julian finds Walsh, and he will, I'm going to make sure your little career at that firm is over. I'm going to make sure you never even file a paper in this city again. You've embarrassed me for the last time by pretending to be more than you are. You're not a Sterling. You're a clerical error. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine with the same dismissive force he'd used for 9 years. He didn't see the folder in my hand. He didn't see the tears that weren't from sadness, but from the absolute, freezing clarity that the erasure was complete. He had looked me in the eye in the building I owned, in the room I had designed, and he had seen a squatter. I waited until he reached the elevator doors, the ones that were still dead because the power was out. I waited until he realized he was trapped 40 stories up with the daughter he despised. The biometric scan on that elevator doesn't recognize your thumbprint, Dad, I said, my voice echoing through the vast, dark penthouse. It only recognizes mine. And Julian didn't hack the server tonight. I let him in. I wanted him to see the watermark. I wanted him to realize that every design he ever stole from my childhood sketchbook was being rejected by the person who actually drew them. Arthur turned, his eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? Silas Thorne didn't sell this building to a man named Walsh, I said, walking toward him, the folder held out like a subpoena. He sold it to me. Walsh is my middle name. My mother's maiden name. The one you made her drop because it wasn't prestigious enough. I am the principal of Vanguard Heritage. I am the owner of the Iron Rose. And according to the secondary deed in this folder, I am also the owner of the land beneath your feet in North Hill. I bought your mortgage from the bank 3 years ago, Dad. You don't live in the Sterling estate. You live in a Walsh rental. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a 9-year foundation finally, completely, giving way. Arthur's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at the folder, then at the deed on the wall, then at the daughter he had spent a decade erasing. But the big reveal wasn't over. As the emergency lights in the hallway finally surged to full power, reflecting off the glass of the penthouse, my phone buzzed with a final, devastating alert. Julian wasn't at the clerk's office anymore. The GPS tracker on his car showed him pulling into the loading dock of the Iron Rose. And he wasn't alone. He had brought the one person I hadn't expected to see until the gala. My mother was in the car. And she was holding a folder of her own, one that appeared to be the original, folded graduation photo. But she wasn't looking at it with pity. She was looking at it with a magnifying glass. The digital time bomb hadn't just hit the Sterlings. It had hit the one secret my mother had been keeping from my father for 30 years. The glass didn't just crack. It shattered. The night air was beginning to howl against the windows as the storm intensified. Arthur was still frozen by the elevator, his world dissolving, while downstairs, my mother and brother were entering the lobby. Julian was carrying a heavy metal case, something he had taken from the vault of Miller and Associates. It wasn't a design. It was a forensic toolkit. He was going to try to prove the signatures were forged. He was going to try to kill the ghost before the sun came up. "You can't do this," Arthur finally whispered, his voice cracking. "You're a girl. You're Elena." "I am the owner of this city, Dad," I said, the words feeling like ice on my tongue. "And you're late for a meeting." I pressed the biometric pad on the wall. The elevator doors hissed open. But instead of the empty car, Julian and my mother were standing inside. They had used a manual override from the lobby. The three Sterlings stood in a triangle of shock, trapped in the entryway of my penthouse. Julian was breathless, his expensive suit rumpled, his eyes wild. My mother was clutching the folded photo so hard her knuckles were white. "Elena," Julian gasped, looking from me to our father, then to the deed on the wall. "I found it. I found the connection. The software, the watermark. It was yours. But it's impossible. You don't have the capital. You don't have the..." "I had the silence, Julian," I said, stepping toward them. "While you were busy being important, I was busy being the owner." "Mom, why are you here?" My mother didn't look at me. She looked at my father. She held up the folded photo, the one from my graduation. But she hadn't just folded me out. She had unfolded the other side. A side I had never seen. There was a fourth person in that photo, standing in the background. A man my father had told us died before I was born. The man who looked exactly like Silas Thorne. "Arthur," my mother said, her voice trembling with a fury that made my father's rage look like a candle flame. "Why is Silas Thorne in our daughter's graduation photo? And why does the bank record for the North Hill mortgage show that he was the one who paid for it 30 years ago?" The room went airless. The rich secret wasn't just mine. It was a generational debt that was finally being called in. My father looked at the photo, his knees buckling. Julian looked at the metal case in his hand, suddenly realizing that the forgery he was looking for wasn't in the deed. It was in his own birth certificate. "The gala is in 48 hours, I said, my voice cutting through the wreckage of their lives. "And I think it's time we discussed the guest list. Because as of this moment, the Sterlings are no longer a family. You're just a collection of secrets in my building." I walked past them, toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city was finally lit up again, the power restored. The Iron Rose was glowing, a beacon of Gothic steel in the heart of Oakhaven. I was the principal. I was the ghost. And for the first time in 9 years, I could breathe. But as I looked down at the street, I saw a fleet of black SUVs pulling up. Not the police. Not the press. It was the security detail for a major foundation, followed by leading financial investigators. They weren't here for a gala. They were here for an arrest. And the warrant wasn't for me. The big reveal had a final, hidden floor. And the elevator was only going down. The air in the penthouse had turned into a vacuum. My father's knees hit the marble floor with a sound that was hollow, like a tree trunk rotting from the inside out. He stared at the unfolded photograph in my mother's hand, at the face of Silas Thorne, the man he had spent decades pretending to despise while secretly living off his ghost. Julian stood frozen, the metal forensic case hanging from his hand like a dead weight. His golden boy persona wasn't just cracking, it was hemorrhaging. He looked at me, then at the photo, then at the father who had built a kingdom on a foundation of sand. This was the night before the gala, the final warning I had meant to deliver, but the truth had a momentum of its own. "You knew," my mother whispered, her voice a serrated blade directed at my father. All those years you told me Silas was a reclusive lunatic who refused to sell. You told me we were the Sterlings, the pioneers of North Hill. But we were just his charity project, weren't we? You didn't build the firm, Arthur. You managed his assets. And when he died, you tried to steal them. I was protecting us. Arthur's voice was a pathetic rasp. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, sudden realization. Elena, you didn't just buy the building. You found the ledgers. You found the records of the management fees I took from Silas's accounts. I didn't have to look for them, Dad, I said, my voice steady enough to cut glass. They were in the server you just had Julian hack. I left them in the primary vault like bait. Julian didn't find leverage tonight. He found the evidence that will put both of you in a federal cell for embezzlement and corporate espionage. That metal case he's holding? It's not going to save the Sterling name. It's going to be the state's Exhibit A. Julian looked down at the case as if it had turned into a live grenade. He dropped it. The heavy metal clanged against the floor, the sound echoing through the 40-story spire. The golden architect finally found his voice, but it was thin and high. I didn't know, Elena. I was just doing what Dad told me. He said the owner of Vanguard was a criminal. He said we were the victims. You weren't a victim, Julian, I said, walking toward him until we were inches apart. You were the one who signed the design documents that used Silas's proprietary structural patents without a license. You were the one who tried to blackmail a clerical assistant because you thought she was too dim to notice you were stealing her life's work. You liked the pedestal, Julian. You liked being the son who mattered. But the pedestal was built out of stolen bricks. My mother turned the photo toward me. And Silas? Why was he at your graduation, Elena? Why was he watching you from the back of the crowd while we were busy making Julian the center of the world? Because Silas Thorne was the only one who saw me, I said, the words feeling like a weight leaving my chest. He saw me because I was the only one who didn't want anything from him. I just wanted to save the iron. I wanted to save the stone. He spent 9 years teaching me how to be the owner of this city because he knew that if he left it to Arthur, it would be torn down for a quick profit. He didn't just give me a building, Mom. He gave me a mirror. And for 9 years, I've been watching all of you fail the test. The sirens began to wail far below, a low, rhythmic moan that drifted up through the rain. The black SUVs I had seen on the monitors weren't just a security detail, they were the consequence of a decade of lies. I looked at the 3 people who shared my DNA and realized I had never been more of a stranger to them than I was in this moment. The final consequence wasn't a speech. It was the sound of the elevator doors opening again, and the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the authorities entering my home. The confrontation at the gate was supposed to be the climax, but as the police moved into the penthouse, the atmosphere shifted from suspense to a cold, clinical reality. My father was read his rights in the very room he had tried to claim as his own. My mother stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the Oakhaven skyline, a woman who had realized her entire social standing was a lease that had just expired. And Julian, the brother who had told me to stay in the kitchen so I wouldn't embarrass the family, was being handcuffed next to a framed deed that bore my name. Wait, Julian shouted as they led him toward the elevator. Elena, you can't let them do this. We're your family. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized the access. I did authorize the access, Julian, I said, watching him with a detached, professional calm. I authorized it so I could record the theft. You wanted a real career, remember? This is the most real thing you've ever done. The elevator doors hissed shut, taking the golden boy and the titan of industry down to the pavement. Only my mother remained, the police allowing her a moment to gather her things because, unlike the men, she hadn't signed the fraudulent filings. She had only signed the invitations to the lie. She looked at me, her face aged a decade in a single hour. What happens now? She asked. The gala is tomorrow night, Mom, I said, walking to the marble counter and picking up the master keycard. And the city expects the Sterling family to be there. But there's been a change in the program. You're not the hosts. You're the evidence. You're heartless, she whispered. No, I replied. I'm the principal. And the principal is done being a ghost. I watched her leave, her heels clicking a hollow rhythm against the stone. The penthouse was silent again, save for the hum of the rain against the glass. I was alone in the sky, exactly where Silas Thorne had predicted I would be. But as I looked down at the folder Vance had left me, the one with the secondary deed, I noticed a small, handwritten note tucked into the back of the ledger. It was Silas's handwriting, dated only 2 days before he died. Elena, it read. The secret isn't just in the stone. It's in the basement. Sublevel 4. There is a vault that Arthur never found. If you're reading this, it means the Sterlings have fallen. Use the key I gave you. Not the one for the building. The one you've been wearing around your neck for 9 years. I reached up, touching the small, rusted iron skeleton key I had worn on a simple chain since I was 22. I had always thought it was a memento, a symbolic key to the heart of the building. I hadn't realized it was functional. I turned toward the service elevator, the one that bypassed the lobby and went straight to the foundations. Sublevel 4 didn't exist on the official blueprints. It was a phantom floor, a hidden pocket of Oakhaven history. As I stepped into the elevator and pressed the hidden sequence Silas had taught me, the car didn't just descend, it felt like it was dropping into the very soul of the earth. When the doors opened, I wasn't in a modern vault. I was in a room of ancient brick and arched timber, a space that predated the tower itself. And there, sitting on a wooden crate in the center of the room, was a man I hadn't seen since I was a child. A man who was supposed to be dead. You're late, Elena, he said, his voice a low, familiar rasp. But I suppose a $50 million restoration takes time. It was Silas Thorne. And he wasn't alone. He was holding a ledger that looked exactly like the one Julian had tried to hack, but this one was bound in dark leather. The gala starts in 24 hours, Silas said, standing up with a strength that defied his supposed age. And the city thinks they're coming to see a building. They're actually coming to see a confession. But before we go upstairs, there's one last secret you need to hear. A secret that your mother almost died to keep. He opened the ledger to the final page, and as I read the name written there, the real name of the Vanguard Heritage founder, the floor felt like it was tilting. The rich secret wasn't just about money, and it wasn't just about the building. It was about the very blood in my veins. I'm not a Sterling, I whispered, the words echoing off the ancient brick. No, Silas replied, a dark, knowing smile touching his lips. You're the reason the Sterlings were allowed to exist at all. And tomorrow night, you're going to tell Oakhaven why. The elevator hissed, signaling someone else was descending. Someone who had the same key. I turned, my heart hammering, as the doors slid back to reveal the one person I thought was halfway to a precinct. Julian was standing there. But he wasn't in handcuffs. He was holding a gun. I didn't think you'd find the basement so fast, sister, Julian said, his golden boy smile replaced by something jagged and lethal. But then again, you always were the one who liked to dig. The cliffhanger wasn't just about the gun. It was about the way Silas didn't even flinch. He just looked at Julian and said, "Hello, grandson. I see you've finally decided to join the family business." The barrel of the gun was the only thing in the room that didn't feel like a relic. It was cold, modern, and focused entirely on the space between my eyes. Julian's hand didn't shake. The desperate, rumpled man who had been led away in handcuffs an hour ago was gone, replaced by a version of my brother that was sharp, cold, and utterly devoid of the golden boy charm. I looked at Silas, expecting shock, but the old man just stood there with his hands behind his back, looking at Julian with a terrifying, patriarchal pride. "The police," I whispered, my voice sounding small in the vast, vaulted basement. "I saw them take you, Julian." "The Oakhaven police work for the people who pay the bills, Elena," Julian said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. And for 30 years, the Sterlings haven't been paying the bills. Silas has. I didn't hack the server tonight to find leverage for Dad. I hacked it because Silas told me it was time to bring you into the fold. The arrest? A theater piece. A way to clear the penthouse so we could have this conversation without Arthur's pathetic whimpering. Silas stepped forward, the light from the single work lamp casting his shadow across the ancient brick like a giant. Your father was a necessary shield, Elena. A mediocre man to hold a mediocre name while I built a legacy that required a certain invisibility. But he grew greedy. He started believing his own lie. He thought he was the architect when he was just the foreman. Julian, put the weapon down. Your sister has earned the right to see the ledger. Julian lowered the gun, but he didn't holster it. He stood by the elevator, a sentinel at the only exit. I looked at the ledger Silas held, the one bound in dark, weathered leather. The big reveal wasn't just about ownership. It was about the key to the city moment I had imagined, but twisted into something far darker. I walked toward the crate, my boots clicking on the damp stone, and looked at the final page. The name written there as the true founder of Vanguard Heritage wasn't Silas Thorne. It wasn't Walsh. It was a name that predated Oakhaven itself, a bloodline that had been whispered about in the city's founding myths. And beneath it, in ink that looked like it had been dried for decades, were 2 birth records. One for Julian. One for me. Both listed Silas Thorne as the biological father. Arthur Sterling is a eunuch in every sense of the word, Silas said, his voice devoid of emotion. Your mother knew the price of the North Hill estate. She knew that to maintain the Sterling facade, she had to provide heirs that carried my blood, not his. You aren't a disappointment because you failed his expectations, Elena. You were a disappointment because you were too much like me. You had the hunger. You had the eyes for the stone. I had to keep you in the shadows, let you build your own kingdom in the dark, to see if you were strong enough to take the throne. You let them treat me like a ghost for 9 years, I said, the rage finally bubbling up, hot and thick. You watched them erase me. You watched my mother fold me out of my own life. And look at what you built because of it, Silas countered. If I had handed you the keys at 22, you would have been Julian, polished, arrogant, and soft. Instead, you became the owner of the Iron Rose. You became the woman who bought her father's mortgage out of spite. You became a ghost that haunts the books of every bank in this state. That is the Thorne legacy. We don't live in the light. We own the light. Julian stepped closer, his face illuminated by the amber glow. The gala tomorrow isn't just an opening, Elena. It's a coronation. The city thinks they're coming to see a restored tower. They're actually coming to meet the 2 people who will run Oakhaven for the next 50 years. But there's a catch. Silas only needs one principal. The other. Well, the other stays in the basement. The air in the sublevel turned freezing. This was the true realization that my 9 years of struggle hadn't been a journey toward freedom, but a curated audition for a madness I never asked for. Silas looked at me, then at Julian, waiting. He had spent a lifetime treating people like chess pieces, and now he was waiting to see which of his children would make the final move. The gala was a sea of silk, champagne, and lies. The Iron Rose Tower hummed with the energy of 1,000 elite guests, all of them marveling at the Gothic stone and the miraculous restoration. In the center of the ballroom, my mother stood alone, a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes darting toward the door as if she expected the police to return at any moment. She was a queen without a kingdom, wearing a dress that was now technically owned by the daughter she had tried to erase. I stood on the mezzanine, looking down at the crowd. I was wearing the silk dress I had chosen weeks ago, the one that cost more than my father's first car. But around my neck, I still wore the iron skeleton key. It felt heavier now. Julian was standing at the podium below, adjusting the microphone, preparing to give the speech of his life. He looked every bit the golden boy, his hair perfect, his smile a masterpiece of deception. The world thought he was the hero of the hour. But as I looked at the VIP elevator, I saw the security team move into position. They didn't look like standard event staff. They were Miller's men, the ones who worked for Silas. The big reveal was minutes away. The city was waiting for the owner of Vanguard Heritage to step into the light. I walked down the grand staircase, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. I could see my mother's face go pale as I approached. She reached out a hand, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg, but I walked past her without a word. I reached the podium just as Julian was finishing his introduction. And so, it is my great honor to introduce the visionary behind this project, Julian said, his eyes meeting mine with a terrifying, silent challenge. The person who saw the soul in the stone when no one else would. My sister, Elena Sterling. The applause was deafening. My father, who had been released on a technicality only an hour prior, stood at the back of the room, his face a mask of broken pride and confusion. He watched as I stepped up to the microphone. This was the moment I had rehearsed in my head for 9 years. The moment I was supposed to humiliate them. The moment I was supposed to claim my crown. But as I looked out at the guests, the cousins, the neighbors, and the titans of industry, I didn't feel like a conqueror. I felt like a woman who had finally seen the exit. For 9 years, I began, my voice amplified by the iron rose itself. My family told everyone I was a waitress. They told you I was an assistant. They told you I was a disappointment because I chose to work with my hands. I held up my hands, the calluses visible even under the soft ballroom lights. They were right about one thing, I said, the room falling into a deathly silence. I am built for the service industry. I am built to serve the history of this city, and to protect it from the people who think they can own it through blood and betrayal. My name is Elena Sterling, and I am the owner of this building. But I am not a Sterling. And I am not a Thorn. I looked directly at Julian, then at Silas, who was watching from the shadows of the balcony. Vanguard Heritage is being dissolved tonight, I announced. The Iron Rose Tower, and every other property in the Walsh portfolio, has been gifted to the Oakhaven Historical Trust. Effective immediately, this building belongs to the people who walk past it every day, not the people who hide in its penthouse. My family spent 9 years waiting for me to become like them. Tonight, I've decided to stay a ghost. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a legacy shattering in real time. Julian's face didn't just drop, it disintegrated. He realized in that moment that the principal position he had been willing to kill for no longer existed. Silas's eyes narrowed, the ancient embers of his gaze turning to cold ash. I had done the one thing a Thorn couldn't understand. I had walked away from the power. I stepped down from the podium, leaving the microphone live. The sound of my heels against the marble echoed through the silent ballroom. I walked toward the front doors. The massive brass doors I had polished with my own hands during the restoration. My mother tried to stop me, her hand catching my sleeve. Elena, wait. You can't just give it away. What about us? What about our home? I hope you kept the receipt for that life you bought, Mom, I said, gently unhooking her fingers. Because the rent is due tomorrow. And I hear the new owners are very strict about the folded guests. I walked out of the Iron Rose Tower and into the cool, midnight air of Oakhaven. The city felt different tonight. The rain had stopped, and the streets were slick and shimmering, reflecting the lights of 1,000 stories that were finally allowed to breathe. I walked away from the music, away from the champagne, and away from the family that had tried to bury me in a cage of gold.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.